Sitting in the middle of the Mediterranean lies a small island named Malta, which in 1798 had enjoyed a period of peace and prosperity for the past several hundred years, partly because it was only a small island that few cared about, but also because it was under the control of the well-known Knights Hospitaller, whose favorite pastime just happened to be building fortifications on the island. Unfortunately for them, Malta was positioned in the path of a certain French general on his way to Egypt. In 1522, the Knights Hospitaller were forced out of their main base on the island of Rhodes by the Ottoman Empire. For several years, the order was without a permanent home, until in 1530, Charles V, as Emperor of the Holy Roman Empire and as King of Sicily, granted the order the island of Malta as a new base to operate from. The order quickly settled into the island and began using it as a base to fight against the Ottoman Empire and Barbary pirates. An attempt was made by the Ottomans to remove the order from the island in 1551 by a force of 10,000 men, but the attempt was abandoned in the face of strong fortifications present on the island. The attempt would, however, convince the Hospitallers to further fortify their position on Malta in case Ottoman forces ever made a more determined attempt to take their home. These further fortifications would prove invaluable, as in 1565 a force of 40,000 Ottomans would lay siege to Malta's fortifications, defended by a force of only 6,000 knights and assorted soldiers. The siege would prove to be a critical moment in the fight against the Ottoman Empire, as all of Christian Europe would watch how the siege progressed very closely. During the siege, repeated bombardments and assaults were made on the fortifications held by the knights. At extremely heavy cost to the attackers, they slowly made progress. After nearly 4 months of fighting, the siege would end in defeat for the Ottomans, as a Spanish-Italian relief force landed on the island and defeated what remained of Ottoman forces as they attempted to retreat. Over 100,000 cannonballs were fired at the fortifications during the siege, reducing many of them to rubble by the end of it, but proving the value of such fortifications in the eyes of the knights. The Great Siege of Malta brought fame and fortune to the Knights Hospitaller, and the island as a whole. Capitalizing on their increased fame, the order constructed a new fortified capital named Valletta. Though the siege devastated Malta, its conclusion would bring a period of prosperity that would last over 200 years to the island, until the beginning of the French Revolution. As fighting against the Ottoman Empire began to calm during the 18th century, the Knights Hospitaller's income shifted to be more and more reliant on France. By the start of the French Revolution, over 2/3 of knights in the order were French, and over half of the order's income came from its property in France. In 1792, the order's French properties were seized by the Revolution, greatly hurting the order's income. Having lost its French support and finding themselves in economic trouble, the Knights Hospitaller would turn to Russia under Tsar Paul I for assistance. In 1797, the Russian Tsar would become the official protector of the Order of Malta. Unfortunately for Malta, that protection would be short-lived. In 1798, Napoleon launched his expedition to Egypt in an attempt to threaten British interests in India. As part of his plan, he considered an attack on Malta due to its value as a base of operations to fight the British Navy in the Mediterranean, and the significant wealth of the island that could be used to help fund his campaign. Spies sent to the island to judge the feasibility of such an attack reported back favorably that the Knights Hospitaller were in a poor condition to offer any resistance to invasion. That would prove an understatement when Napoleon's invasion fleet reached the island on June 9th. Within 2 days of arriving, the entirety of Malta was under French control, with almost no casualties for the French. Despite the large number of fortifications on Malta and the accumulated wealth of the Knights Hospitaller, the island fell almost without a fight, which raises the question of why so little resistance to the French was offered. Even with their recent financial difficulties, the Knights Hospitaller had the resources necessary to defend the island if they so wished. What they did not have, however, was the will or the men required to do so. With most of the order being French, many of its members were sympathetic to the revolution taking place back in their home country and were unwilling to fight against a French invasion. More generally, however, the knights simply did not have enough men to effectively man all their fortifications. The majority of military forces on the island were made up of locals, with members from the knight order in the leadership positions. Standing forces for the defense numbered less than 5,000 men, supplemented by several thousand more militia, intended to mostly man fortifications or local areas. Even with the average Maltese soldier or militiaman being more willing to fight the French than the knights leading them, with no proper leadership and so much area to cover, prolonged resistance would be impractical. Inaction, meanwhile, would be the defining trait of Grand Master Hompesch during the invasion. His hesitation and inability to organize a proper defense of the island meant that when the French began landing troops and quickly taking fortifications, little could be done to oppose them. Local attempts were made to resist some of the French landings, but all such attempts failed. Panic began setting in as the French advanced, with several knights being killed by mobs after rumors of surrender spread. After just 2 days, Hompesch capitulated, surrendering the island and all of its fortifications to the French. Several days after that, most of the knights would leave Malta or join Napoleon's army, and though the order would find shelter elsewhere in places such as Russia, the order would never again own significant territory of its own. After Malta's surrender, Napoleon would spend just 6 days on the island before he and his fleet moved on to Egypt. During his short stay on Malta, Napoleon completely reformed the way the island was governed so as to implement French revolutionary ideas. Feudalism was abolished, slavery ended, and political prisoners released. At the same time, however, the French looted much of the island's wealth, including that of the Catholic Church. The Church owned extensive properties on the island, and the French seized many religious orders' property while looting large amounts of wealth from said seized property. Churches that were allowed to remain were also required to give up their gold and jewels. By the time Napoleon left Malta, his war chest for his expedition had more than tripled from 3 million francs, looted from Switzerland, to 10 million francs. Even after Napoleon, most of the French departed Malta for Egypt, the garrison left behind continued to seize wealth from the church to help fund military efforts and the new government on the island. Eventually, such actions would begin the downfall of French control over Malta, as the population would turn against the French. The French garrison left on Malta numbered only roughly 5,000 men, less than what had even defended the island when the French initially invaded. This put the French occupation in a perilous position, as it had no hope of sufficiently manning every fortification on the island. Anger at the French was not long in coming, as soon after the British victory at the Battle of the Nile, a Maltese uprising began on the 2nd of September. It was mainly triggered over anger at the seizure of church property and began after another auctioning of church property was announced. Riots quickly spread across the island, and a militia established by the French switched sides to join the growing rebellion. Several small French garrisons were massacred, forcing most of the remaining French troops to retreat into Valletta. From September 1798 to September 1800, Valletta would be under siege and blockade. At sea, the ships blockading access to Valletta were mostly British, but were also briefly joined by a Russian squadron. On land, the siege was initially composed of over 10,000 Maltese irregulars, but that number quickly shrank as food became a serious problem on Malta. Some British and Portuguese forces would reinforce the siege, but not in large numbers. Throughout the siege, no attempts were made to take the city by force, as wider fighting across Europe and the Mediterranean meant that ending the siege was not a priority for the British or coalition. During the 2 years that it took to starve the French garrison out, British, Maltese, Portuguese, and Italian troops from Naples would take part in the siege at one point or another. For the French, the siege was a desperate struggle to make their food last as long as possible. Malta did not have large food stocks, as it had to import much of its food. And in addition to the several thousand French soldiers, 40,000 Maltese citizens also had to be fed within the rapidly worsening conditions of the siege. The French were led by a General Vaubois, who only had 7 months' worth of food at the beginning of the siege. To improve his situation, he almost immediately expelled much of the civilian population and began rationing food. His situation would improve somewhat in the early days of the blockade, as several supply ships managed to slip through to the harbor. But other than the small amount of supplies they provided, he was completely cut off from support from France. All other attempts to resupply him or reinforce his position failed. As the months dragged on, effects of the siege on Vaubois' troops worsened, as a lack of food and the stress of the siege led to deteriorating health for many of the defenders. A small breakout attempt was conducted shortly before the end by using what few seaworthy ships were left in harbor, but little faith was put into the attempt. The ships were given skeleton crews and were all caught before making it anywhere near safe harbor. After 2 long years, the defenders finally ran out of food. With its men dying by the dozens or even hundreds every day and no other options available, Vaubois finally surrendered the last French fortifications of Malta to the British on the 4th of September, 1800. The British would not leave the island for over 150 years. Part of the Treaty of Amiens that temporarily ended hostilities between France and Great Britain was that Malta was to be returned to the Knights Hospitaller, but the British refused to return the island, contributing to the outbreak of war again in 1803 and to anger from Russia. The new Tsar Alexander I, as protector of the order, demanded the return of the island to the Knights Hospitaller before agreeing to any alliance with the British, but eventually dropped the demand as the threat of Napoleon grew. Sovereignty over the island would officially be given to the British in 1814 after the Treaty of Paris, leaving the Knights of St. John without a home. The order was left with its sovereignty but no territory, and for the most part faded from importance. A quick fact that I just found interesting but decided not to include in the main story of the video is that the Knights Hospitaller were actually offered the island of Gotland in 1806 by Sweden, but they refused the offer in hopes of eventually regaining Malta. It certainly would have been interesting, though, if they had accepted the offer and re-established themselves somehow in the Baltics. Anyway, thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed the video, and please come back again if you enjoyed the content.